Okay, you're live.
Great, thank you. All right, I think we will start as there are 5 members of the committee present. Is there a motion to convene the meeting?
I make that motion, but I would ask that Sally, I think Mike was having a little trouble connecting, and he asked me to resend the link, but I don't know if I can send him my link. Is there a different?
I'm on.
Okay, good.
And John, the answer to that question is no.
Right. Thank you.
Is there a second to the motion to convene the meeting?
I second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is carried. The meeting is officially convened. Are there any other is there any other member of the public present? Any other attendees visiting the meeting? There don't appear to be. Okay. With respect to the minutes of the joint meeting with the Board of Ethics and the review and approval of minutes of the meeting of November the 6th, edits came in on the late side. Both meetings were very detailed and filled with content. So what I'd like to do is seek a motion on each for the preliminary approval of minutes so that we all can have a little more time to go through them, make any changes that are required, and then we can confirm the approval or make the approval of the minutes final at our next meeting. Sally, do I run afoul of any rules by making that suggestion?
I'm sorry. I was really not paying attention. Can you tell me again what you want to do?
Sure. What I'd like to do, because we have 2 sets of minutes, one for the joint meeting with the Board of Ethics and the other, our meeting on November the 6th. They are both very data intensive, and our members have made a number of suggested changes. So for purposes of protocol, what I would like to do is get a vote of the committee to conditionally approve the minutes, subject to a final approval at our next meeting.
Dan, the only caveat with minutes is you have to have a draft prepared within 2 weeks of the meeting. So as long as you have a draft, you're good.
Great. We do have drafts. They have been submitted duly, and they are before us. So if with that in mind, that's how I'd like to proceed, and it gives us some time to review both. And as always, thanks to Brian for a very quick rendition of those drafts, which are, as I said, very data intensive. So first, with respect to the joint meeting with the Board of Ethics, is there a motion to conditionally approve those minutes?
I make that motion.
Thank you. Any discussion on this motion? In the absence of any discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, we have conditionally approved the minutes of the joint meeting with the Board of Ethics.
And
Moving
so
on
was
to
that-
the review and approval, conditional approval of the minutes of the meeting of November 6th.
Sorry, was
Is
there a
there-
second on the?
Uh,
I don't think anyone seconded it.
oh, I second that motion.
Okay, thank you.
Is there a motion to review and approve the minutes conditionally for November the 6th, 2020?
I make a motion.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? If in the absence of any discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. That motion is carried, and those minutes are conditionally approved, subject to final approval at our next meeting, and thank you for that. Moving on to the third agenda item regarding the status of the mailing of our solicitation meeting letter to the community organizations. That letter's in final. I believe it is going out in the village's blast email to the community, I think today.
Yeah, I have
And-
one, I'm sorry, Dan, I have one question on that.
Yes,
In what we're sending out in the village email, in the letter, it asks for input from residents. Many, not many, I know some of our village employees are residents. And Jerry has said that we cannot speak to any village employees. Excuse me, so is that an issue?
that kind of falls into my next a point I was going to make, or regarding what I have in mind would be to make a request of the clerk and the Board of Trustees to send our letter to village employees. I inferred from the response that we, the committee, can't, but I believe the village has the discretion to do so at our request. So my thought was to ask our committee, the Ad Hoc committee, for their thoughts on we as a committee asking the clerk and the Board of Trustees to communicate our letter to village employees and their labor unions. So
Right,
what
except-
is, go ahead.
I thought Jerry made it very clear that we could not speak with them. So if we're issuing the letter, who should they be going back to?
I don't know that he can prohibit village employees from speaking to the ad hoc committee. Any member of the public should be able to speak to the ad hoc committee. And I don't know that he could bar them from doing that. Can take another look at that letter.
Dan, can I
Yes.
offer one thing?
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
what we should do is just request that the manager send the letter, either directly to the employees or to the union for forwarding through. And if that doesn't work, then we communicate to the board, say, we believe that this is very important, that they are a significant stakeholder group, and we'd like this to go to them.
Yeah. Any views on that, please?
I think that's a good idea, just to have like a third party kind of mediate, because I understand like the prohibition of speaking to village employees.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking directly to the union membership and leadership might be a problem, but a blanket contact to the employees, I don't see how that is an issue. You know, it's an FYI.
It is.
This process is going to happen whether or not the village employees are participants in it. And, you know, it would be best if village employees were participants in.
I just realized I was not in the picture. I'm now in the picture. I apologize for that. That was totally unintentional on my part.
I thought you were driving.
That's Michael who's driving.
I'm kidding. I was kidding.
Right, of course. Sorry about that. I did my first PowerPoint on Zoom the other night. I belong to a bar association committee that for which I prepared a report, and so I can consider that to be a milestone in my life, having been able to do that. And here I am taking my, not remembering to my picture out there. Anyway, I think that's a good suggestion. Again, I don't want to go off camera and look for the email, but it seems to me there's no bar. I can't conceive of a bar of the committee or the village not wanting to communicate with village employees. They are among the most important constituent groups regarding the Board of Ethics. So I like the suggestion about asking the village manager to communicate or send our letter to the village employees as step one. Any other thoughts on that?
I had one question. So if like an employee came to us and they also live in the village and they're like, I'm speaking to you as a resident and not an employee, like what are the implications of that? Because like a lot of people get up to the board of trustees and like, oh, I'm not speaking as a board member, I'm just speaking as a private citizen. So like, how does that, like, what are the implications of that?
My reaction to that, Brian, is that given the rules under which we operate, we take it for what it's worth, and that person's communications with us are part of the public record, and we interpret it accordingly. I think we will take any and all suggestions without regard to the source of those suggestions or comments for that matter.
Okay. What I'm saying is like, how do I phrase it? Like then would they, I don't know, be punished for speaking to us, even if they claim they're speaking as a resident and not as an employee?
I can't conceive of, I mean, that would violate to me so many provisions of involving retribution, retaliation. I don't see it as a possibility. Even if one were to interpret the comment as that of an employee, they have a right to speak to us. They have a right to bring complaints without fear of retribution. So I don't have a concern about that. Others may have other views on that.
Then I think we need to go back to Jerry in response to his email. Because right now, a couple of days ago, he sent his opinion and we just let it sit.
Does anyone have that letter or that email response in front of them? Because, as I said, I don't want to go off screen to look for it.
I'll go off screen. I'll take a look.
All right, because I'd like the actual language of his reply to be sure that we know whether he is prohibiting any communication at all. While we're waiting for,
Oh, sorry. Are you talking about the one from Miss Mason?
No, the one
Maybe-
from Jerry Barbario.
Okay, sorry, there were so many emails.
Which for some reason I can't find.
Let me see if I can find it.
yeah, I'm just looking at it separately on my phone, and I don't see it. But
Was I copied? Do you remember?
You may have been. I don't remember.
all right, I'm gonna go off for just a moment and see if I can find it. Doing a keyword now.
I also have one other thing, printing after you, Jonathan.
Pardon?
Sorry, I was talking, I'm gonna mute.
I think you're talking to me.
What I have is from Christy Mason. The village manager has confirmed that the committee should not communicate directly with VOM employees of their labor unions. I think that's the admonition we received.
All right, so my apologies if I send everyone on a bad chase looking for Jerry.
That's fine. That's fine. So what I like the suggestion of making a request of the village manager. So if someone can put that in the form of a motion, so that it is a decision of the committee, and we'll make that request if it's voted upon.
I'll make that motion.
And why don't you articulate the motion?
Okay. I make a motion to ask the village manager to forward our letter to the village employees and the union seeking comments on the code of ethics.
Why don't we leave it at the employees for now,
All right, the
so that
employees.
we don't make the issue a little more make the request a little more simplified.
Are the employees then?
Can we a discussion on this motion?
Is there a second?
I second it.
I second it.
Okay.
Discussion.
Yeah, I mean,
Discussion.
I think the process would be to get clarification from Jerry about why this would be an issue. And I think the way to do that is make the request a formal request, and then if it's denied, then go to the Board of Trustees.
Right, so, but that brings me back to my initial question. In our letter, we are seeking input from residents. And there are village employees who are residents. So if we include our letter in today's email blast before reaching out to Jerry and hearing back from him, is this an issue?
I think residents, you know, as I think Dan said, I think residents are, regardless of whether they're employees or not, are not precluded from weighing in. You know, they don't give up their rights as a resident when they become an employee.
But John, they may have an employment obligation to bring these matters through their chain of command, and I don't want to put them in a situation where they, you know, are in conflict with that, right? Because they agreed to work and they agreed to abide by the rules that are established. And so, although they're residents, we may be putting them in a difficult position.
No, I understand that, but that's their decision to go to their union and resolve things through their union, right? I mean, that's theoretically they have multiple avenues. You know, they can either choose to go through. Frankly, we're discussing process, not specifics of a particular issue. So, you know, a resident who is also an employee who had a hypothetical issue could feel free to talk to us. If they had a specific issue and they were naming names, then that would be a different case.
I would just like to think that anybody who comes to us, you know, had the blessing of the village on this matter, because I can't see why it would be a problem. And so I'd like to think that the manager would say, fine, if you'd like to communicate ideas or suggestions to the committee, feel free to do it.
I appreciate the attention to process, and I think this is a not insignificant point. We can perhaps cure this by either changing the salutation on the letter that goes out today, or we can send a letter to village employees that says, "Dear village employee," or we can just change the salutation permanently and say something along the lines of "to all who are concerned," or "to all who have an interest," because we are clearly also going to be communicating with community organizations and with the Chamber of Commerce, with businesses and vendors, for that matter, many, if not most of whom are not going to be residents of Mamaroneck.
Right, but in the body of the letter, we have, it's not just a salutation. We have the word residents who we're seeking input from. Or at least in what Robert sent out last night.
Well, let's see. The trustees created the ad hoc committee, selected the following residents, seeking input from various stakeholders, neighborhood associations, community organizations, residents, and businesses. Does not mention employees.
No, but it says residents. That's the word I'm zeroing in on.
Which mention of residents are you focusing on?
The one
Ellen?
you just read, in neighborhood associations, residents, there are residents who are employees. So I'm just trying to make sure.
Can you just put something in parens that says other than village employees, residents other than village employees?
Don't we want to hear from village employees?
We do, but I thought we just agreed we were going to reach out to Jerry to find out why he's saying we can't speak with them.
You want to hold this till next Friday?
Personally, I mean, I don't really want to hold it till next Friday, but I think it makes sense because I think the message has to be consistent and clear. And I think if I don't have any problem with it, but I also understand Mike's point that, if they are represented by a union, they have certain procedures that they've agreed to work through, and they may be different. I get, or they may have a hierarchically they may come first, but I think we need clarification from Jerry about communicating with the employees.
The enabling legislation does not define specific groups with whom we should consult. That's I believe, our choice. Nor, as a practical matter, can we or would we not ignore any communications we received. My thought would be to, rather than, we can provide examples of various stakeholders, but we can also make the letter clearer by saying we are seeking input. The ad hoc committee is seeking input from any interested parties, including neighborhood associations, community organizations, residents, and businesses. And I think we should add village employees. But if it is the sense of the committee to get clarification from the village manager first, I will defer to the wishes of the committee.
I think that what you say there is that the legislation that was enacted allows us to do it. As a courtesy to the manager, I think we give it today and send them, say, look, we feel this is important. You know, we'd like to work with you on how we can get this to them. They're an important group here. And then if that doesn't work with him, then we just go forward, right? But we gave him an opportunity.
Or, conversely, another way of reaching out to Jerry, and I know he took a quick look at the letter the other day because Sally sent it to him, asking him to take a quick look. But maybe we re-forward the letter and confirm that he's okay with the wording.
The
And if
present
he's
wording,
okay with,
the present wording?
yep, which says residents. He knows there are village employees who live in the village.
I don't know. I
Okay.
keep going back and forth on this, but I understand the point that Mike is trying to make, but I also understand that, at some point we need to ask for feedback. What we're looking for is feedback about the process, and anybody who has been involved in the process or has a suggestion about how the process can be better is what we're looking for. And we don't really care where the information comes from.
I agree with that, but I think at the same time, we need to be able, at the end of the day, we're coming up with XYZ recommendations for changes. And it's going to go to the Board of Trustees, but I would hazard a guess they would also be reaching out to Jerry for his thoughts on the process or recommendations. So I don't think it's a good idea to go around Jerry.
I agree. Can I make a suggestion? I would make a motion if everybody agrees. Let's let the chairman contact Jerry directly and discuss our concerns, and maybe a telephone call can resolve this, if the chairman were agreeable to doing this.
I'm fine doing it. I would want him on the record at some point. I don't know him. I've never spoken with him, but I would assume that any public official is okay with us receiving different points of view. But I'm happy to take that recommendation and communicate.
Or anybody on the board who was familiar with him. That doesn't have to be the chairman. I just have somebody communicate with him, and then he could summarize his comments back to us in an email.
Well, I'm happy to do that. And I do want us to reach as many people as possible and invite as many comments as possible from different places. So if it's the sense of the board of the committee that I should communicate with Jerry and get his views on this, I'm happy to do that. I am at the same time very eager to get our letter out as widely as we can. Does this prevent us from or hold us up from sending the letter to the Chamber of Commerce and to community organizations while we're waiting?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Okay. So
I think would only just be the delay in the weekly email.
okay, so we're just holding back on the blast email to the community, to that mailing list. Is that correct?
Ellen? I think Ellen's frozen.
Yes, and I'm going to dial in. I keep freezing. So I'll be back in a minute.
Okay.
But to answer your question before I freeze again, if you get to Jerry this afternoon, I think Robert gave us till 4 o'clock for changes. We may still be able to get it in today's email blast.
Okay. So what am I asking him?
I would ask him if he's okay with the wording. Since I'm the one who raised this issue, I would zero in on the word residents, knowing that some employees are residents. But you can also then cite the legislation behind it.
Could
Okay.
I add one thing here? I would think we would ask the manager, we just want to make sure that we have the opportunity, or that any employee has the opportunity to come and tell us what they feel about the processes regarding the ethics laws, right? That they should be free to come to us without fear of any repercussions, resident or not.
Okay. I'm prepared to do that. And that would mean that if I am able to talk to him and get that point of view, the blast email goes out. If I am unable to talk to him for one reason or another, or he asks to defer a decision to a later date, that the blast email does not go out. And is that a correct inference? I take it then by silence that that's a correct inference.
I don't think Ellen's back on yet, and Mike, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. All right. Will, when Ellen is back on, I can repeat that. Sorry for that. Sorry. Let me disconnect that. Okay. Moving on to through the agenda. Sally, I have a question for you. Forgive me if I missed your reply or I'm behind the curve on this, but I think you said you had a couple of contacts for organizations to whom we can send a letter. Have you sent that to us, or have you assembled that?
Yeah, I sent it to Brian
Yeah, I have it.
yesterday.
Oh, great.
Because I'm still compilating each list until I
Great.
have one large list. So thank
So
you.
we can send that. We can send that out. We can send a letter to those organizations. Brian?
Yes, if it's final.
How are you going to pay for envelopes and postage?
Oh, in other words, these were addresses. These were not email
Yeah, they're
addresses.
addresses.
Oh, actually, no, I guess you could get email addresses, Brian. I'm sorry. Yeah. They were just association names and then a contact at that association. But you could get emails, Brian, yes.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Let's go through any updates on any individual committee member tasks regarding, say, training or other codes of ethics. Any comments?
I'm waiting for a call back from the gentleman in the state, but from what I've been able to find out on the state's website, the only ethics class they offer is the one on conflicts of interest. There are no more scheduled. So, but my one question that I want to ask, is it offered once a year? Or is it ad hoc? Is it on request? But the PowerPoint is available that they used. But in looking through their list of class offerings, there's a whole lot on finances and budgeting and reporting, nothing else on ethics.
Okay.
But I am waiting to speak to someone, so I've left a message.
Okay. I don't think we have Jocelyn on. Are there any other comments on work in progress or individual tasks?
I will say that, I don't know if everybody's gone through the various codes of ethics for the neighboring municipalities, but every one of them, I believe every one of them, I may be wrong, states that the ethics board issues advisory opinions upon written request.
Well, there are a few interesting things in the other municipalities. So to answer your question, yes, I have read them. What jumped out at me on that was that the other municipalities all have either the village manager as part of the ethics board or a member of the board of trustees.
I don't think everyone did, because I was kind of paying attention to that, because I do remember there were a couple that had no elected officials, and then a couple that had one elected official or officer.
Yeah, I'll do a tally on that, but it was more than 50% for sure. So that's one of the things that jumped out at me. What jumped out at me going back to training on our code, it says that the ethics board is responsible for delivering annual training and to prepare the training materials. Which I found somewhat shocking.
It's interesting to have a village manager or a trustee on an ethics board, which puts them in receipt of what could be very confidential information.
But I think some of that can get to what we've discussed previously. Does our ethics board have any teeth? There's a whole lot of responsibility and absolutely no authority.
Well, I mean, the other way to look at it is none of the other ethics boards had nearly the responsibility that ours does.
Correct. I agree with that.
Every one of them is advisory,
Yep.
and every one of them requires a written request for somebody to get an ethics board opinion. Nowhere mentioned in any of the other codes was subpoena or investigations, by the way.
Yep, I agree.
So, and New York State has an extensive whistleblower law. So, the idea that we need a separate whistleblower law in the village is kind of, I don't think we could do a whistleblower law justice, more justice than New York State can give it. Because it's constantly reevaluated and updated, and Matt, I was shocked at how in-depth the whistleblower law is in New York State. So
is your takeaway, John, that we adopt the New York State whistleblower law as part of the?
I don't think you need to adopt it. It's the law. It's the law of the state. It carries in New York. And the idea, when I was on the board and we proposed the revision to the ethics law, one thing that stood out to me and that I have probably not raised, and it didn't occur to me until I was listening to Mark and the rest of the ethics board, is we had a full-time village attorney at the time that the ethics law was previously written. When that came into effect. And it was anticipated that the village attorney would be used as a sounding board for both the boards and the employees and the committees. It does not seem like that's taking place now. So it seems like the ethics board is being used for de facto free legal advice.
Yep. I think we have put, knowingly or unknowingly, so I'm not trying to point blame to anyone. I think we have put a whole lot of responsibility on a volunteer citizen committee.
I agree. I agree 100%.
And to me, that's enabling our officials to kind of be, excuse me for saying it this way, deaf, dumb, and blind. They have no skin in the game. And I have a huge issue with that.
Could you articulate that a little more? I didn't quite understand what your comment about no skin in the game.
If you read through this section of our code on what the ethics board is responsible for, it all falls on the board, the ethics board. So that our officials only get involved if something is put in front of them, but there's nothing to enforce action. I mean, I don't know how to say it. I don't see any accountability on part of our village management, in the broadest sense, village management.
Let me just clarify what I agreed to, because I agree with what you're saying partly. I just felt that this was a lot of work and that that was being put on this board.
Mm-hmm.
And I questioned whether a volunteer could really do this level of work. And I couldn't, right? And I don't know if they need to be supplemented by what John said, the village attorney or somebody's there to help them. But I felt, as if it's a lot of work for the volunteer.
It is. It's a full-time job in theory, or it could be.
Jocelyn just emailed saying she clearly has the time wrong. I'm just replying to her. I was very interested in this idea of these periodic informal opinions, and which go to the Board of Ethics. The New York City permits or has a practice of handling informal questions as they arise in order to guide people appropriately, but they have a separate legal office that does that. It's not the Conflict of Interest Board itself, or it's associated with the Conflict of Interest Board. And the village, I think, should have some mechanism for handling these kinds of inquiries, in addition to, and I believe the Conflict of Interest Board of the city can convert an informal inquiry into an anonymous advisory opinion if it's important enough. But it's viewed as a good valve for helping employees make decisions on, at least I think, very minor matters where they have a concern.
But Dan, I appreciate that. And I think, just ostensibly that was what the village board thought would be happening with the law the way it is now. And clearly that's not happening. And,
Okay.
the intention was if somebody came to the ethics board with, let's just call it a generic ethics issue, that ethics issue would be published, that the opinion would be published to provide further guidance to sort of gradually refine the law. And that really hasn't happened, for whatever reason, maybe because it's, requires a level of, it probably is a lot more work than we anticipated when we passed the law, frankly. And, but I think the issues that you're raising leave it open-ended, because you could have an issue where you have an employee or a board member who asks for an opinion, and they, in the end, get an opinion, but it's an informal opinion that's not recorded anywhere. They act upon that advice, and somebody questions an act that they took, and there's no documentation from the ethics board that they weighed in on it. That's a very dangerous position to put a board member or a, employee in, and unfair, especially if they've come to the board for that kind of opinion. And that's why, it was anticipated that the village attorney would be more actively involved in this, because presumably they would be an officer of the village and they would be responsible for acting on the village's behalf, and they would have a legal obligation to keep a record of that. And
so that gets to one of my big concerns with all of this, and it's probably because of my work background. I don't think we have any documented procedures or process. And
we don't know, the ethics board doesn't.
Is there a documented procedure? If you're an employee and you have a question, this is who you should contact. This is how long it will take you to get a response. That response will be documented. That response will be stored for X number of years. If you don't submit your disclosure form, this is what happens. You need to submit it by February 15th every year. Whatever. There needs to be a procedural document.
Yep, I agree. But I think we're on two. I agree with you on both, but I think there are two separate issues. One is procedurally, the disclosure forms, who's required to file them, when they have to be filed, what happens if they're not filed in time, the removal process of a board member if they're not filed in time.
I'm talking really all in general, all in. We need a front to back procedural document. And I know, coming from financial services where we had to do 9 million classes every year around all sorts of compliance things, including ethics, in that training, there was always high-level procedures. Backed up, compliance always had the detailed procedural forms that were issued. And I think that's one thing that's missing.
Well, I'm with you. I am a real estate agent, and I can tell you we have to go through ethics training every 2 years, and we have to go through all kinds of, to be affiliated with a company. They want to make sure that there's not a legal, that they've covered their bases on in a legal sense. So they want to make sure that, there's not a liability issue for you. So they make sure that you have all kinds of legal training, and then they document the training that's occurred.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think the direction we're going, this is a very good discussion. And I think we have clearly identified a very critical issue. And I would suggest that we start to put some specific detail and some thoughts to how we create a protocol or a rules to follow for inquiries of the unethical decisions. I was as trouble, I think John or Ellen, one of you mentioned during our meeting with the Board of Ethics, the hypothetical or example you raised as to what happens if I call the Board of Ethics and I say, can I do X, Y, or Z? And I get an informal opinion saying, yes, you can. And then at a later time, I'm charged with violating the code or something else. And I said, no, I got an opinion from John Doe, the Board of Ethics, and there's no record of it. That's of concern, and that should be addressed. So why don't we resolve to start thinking of how we can put together procedures for that very exercise. And it is a good segue to some of the other issues that arose in the joint meeting we had, and some of the bullet points I've laid out. And that is aside from, I'm now separating that from Mark Ettinger's email to us. There, with respect to disclosure requirements, clearly we're being asked to address that and how to make sure or ascertain that that requirement is called for. And it brings into the discussion whether the Board of Ethics and the Code of Ethics should provide for penalties or fines. The New York state law does not require boards of ethics to impose penalties, but I believe it is permissive. And we may arrive at a point where we ask the village attorney whether we can enact such sanctions, up to and including whether we could bar a duly elected official from taking his or her seat for failure to file a disclosure statement. There, as I think Ellen, you just pointed out, there needs to be some teeth in that law. How
Yep.
far we can go is open to question. So I put that out on the floor, noting that it is 5 minutes to 1. I don't want to run too late, but we obviously have a lot of business to conduct. So what are your thoughts on that?
Going back a little bit and looping it into what you just asked, I almost think we need to take every part of that code and outline what the potential ramifications for noncompliance would be or could be. And the steps that are involved in ensuring compliance.
Any other comments on that?
Are any of you familiar with something called a RACI matrix?
No.
I'm not. Never heard of
Okay.
it.
Sorry, my background is a lot of process stuff. So RACI is an acronym for responsible, accountable, consultative, or informed. So, let's stick with the annual disclosures. Who's responsible for obtaining it? Who's accountable to ensuring it's obtained? Who needs to be consulted if there are perhaps any issues? And who needs to be informed on the status of obtaining or potential issues? And you would fill that out across the board. And that's one, section by section by section of the code. And that's one way, you could get to a procedural document, but two, you could see clearly where we have teeth behind the code and where we don't. I'll lay out an example over the next week and get it out to everyone.
It's a good point. If my opinion is correct, I was troubled by the idea that this Board of Ethics, this Board of Citizen Volunteers, is responsible for enforcing the disclosure requirement. It should not be in the hands of people who are doing this on a part-time basis. There should be a municipal official responsible for monitoring this and enforcing it. And although I am okay with the Board of Ethics monitoring it and then informing the clerk, for example, that in the absence of compliance, that penalties are now appropriate to be assessed, something to that effect. I mean, we can arrive at some resolution of that, but I think this is the direction I think we should be going in.
Yep. But I was also equally shocked to hear that the ethics board was responsible for preparing training materials and delivering training.
Well, that was, to be fair, that was when I was on the board, that was what we envisioned the ethics board focusing more of their time and energy on than anything else, was the idea of it being an educational board and not a punitive board. And, the idea that employees could ask for, interpretations of village code or how things applied to them, in conjunction with the village attorney and the ethics board. That was how it was envisioned. And it frankly, it never came about that way.
Right.
I see training as an HR function administered by a permanent employee of an entity.
Yep. I agree.
And also, given the complexity and of such a subject, why I mentioned and still think that spending the money on a turnkey training responsibility might be the direction we should go in, because there are companies that do this and they just manage everything. But that's something for us to discuss as we get close to putting together recommendations. Let's, Sally, a question for you. In our meeting with the Board of Ethics, they said they'd made recommendations for legislation, changes in legislation. Are those kept anywhere? Can we get a look at those?
If they sent them to me, I'll have them.
Okay.
'Cause I'm secretary
Thank you.
to their board, so.
Yeah,
let you know.
Thank you. I would like to see, they're having said it several times. I'd like to see what it is they recommended. I'd like to move on to the email from Mark Ettinger, which I believe you all received, which adds additional subject matters for our consideration. And I want to be I want to be very careful that we look at the underlying recommendations and not devote any attention or opinion to the litigation which Mark referenced and which appears to be to underlie some of the suggestions. I would just like to address the subject matter themselves, and we as a committee can determine whether these recommendations and this subject matter is worthy of our attention, and if so, how we address it. And that, I think, is consistent with what the view we all have expressed before. In addition to the bullet points that I included in the agenda, I observed in the email a recommendation on regarding the prohibition of interference with investigations, a requirement to act on Board of Ethics decisions within 90 days, amending disclosure requirements regarding the disclosure of interests in matters, and a recommendation that the oath of office be broadened to take into consideration village laws.
Can I interrupt just for a second? Because our oath of office does. I meant to say something during your meeting. I don't have it in front of me, but I think you all got it. It's that you will follow the rules and regulations of the Village of Mamaroneck and then the state of New York.
Okay.
I can send it to you again if you need it.
Easy to get. It's easy to get, not necessary. Having signed the oath myself, I probably should know what it said.
We all should.
Any comments on any of those subject matters? I certainly, it's now part of our record that they have made those suggestions. And are there any thoughts about addressing these subject matters and any views on them?
I mean, my feeling, going back to the interference of, members or commission, it sounds a little authoritative and authoritarian, to me that was disconcerting to think that the ethics board I don't know. That was suggesting we give them more power was troubling in that sense.
I think we can accept these as suggested topics for discussion without having to formally reply as a committee to what we think about them. I think we can, for example, I think the comment made about being more specific on what recusal amounts to is worthy of discussion. And we can address that. My reaction to the Section 2113 on prohibition of interference is, I think, would be very difficult to address as a subject, particularly, and to articulate it in the context of the code, but that's my immediate reaction. So what I would suggest is that if a member of our committee would like to take on one of these subjects and suggest language to amend our code or to address it in the code, then please go ahead and do so and make the recommendations accordingly. And as I said, I for one may take a crack at the recusal, because I think I've always thought it's something that just generally should be addressed. I may change my mind on it. Any other comments regarding that, or any other business that anyone wishes to discuss at this point?
I have a question for Sally.
Yes.
Did you confirm or not that Nora is our liaison?
You know what? The mayor said let it lie for now. So
Okay.
he
So
did
we don't have
not.
a liaison.
The mayor appoints liaisons, and we're having our annual organization meeting in a couple of weeks. So I don't know if he just wants to do it at that point.
Okay.
So, and I don't have it. It's not in either of the resolutions. It's not in the resolution constituting you or appointing you. So it was not done officially.
All right. No big deal.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So any other
So-
subjects we should?
Dan,
Go ahead.
sort of to go back to the issue that you raised about, or the discussion that you'd like to have about language regarding recusal. One of the issues that we ran into, just as a frame of reference, one of the issues that we ran into when we were discussing with the village attorney at the time how to delineate who should recuse and who should not. And we did discuss, is it the idea that somebody within the notification zone should be recused, or is it the idea that somebody who lives nearby should be recused? And the thing that the village attorney explained to us was, it has to be more than just an association. There has to be a direct, noticeable financial or personal interest in why somebody should have to recuse. And, and that discussion did happen with the Board of Trustees when I was on the board. And, we went round and round trying to figure out for these various committees, if there was a line to be drawn somewhere. And, that was a challenge, to be fair.
I understand that. I think that I don't know that we will or should address or get down into the weeds on whether you're within an area, a notice area or not. It's so hard to define if you're not, you just wind up reacting to a specific issue. I think as you have to rely upon people to use their judgment in saying, well, there's an appearance here that I could be impacted, and therefore I should make inquiry, or therefore I should recuse. And you have to rely upon people of good faith to do that. My thought on recusal was that if you do recuse, perhaps the code, or there should be some requirement that, yes, indeed, once you recuse, you revert to being another member of the public and you no longer take part in any discussion in executive session or otherwise on that issue.
But I think that's generally what recusal means. I mean, be that as it may, maybe it's procedurally, as Ellen has said, it needs to be spelled out better. You know,
Worthy
I would agree with that for sure.
John, can I interrupt for 1 second? I
Sure.
apologize. I have to drop right now for a few moments, and I will dial back. It's on the record, but I have to drop.
Thank you, Michael. Okay. All right. Any other matters for our discussion? If not, I will proceed to after the meeting to call Jerry Barbario, and we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make that motion.
I second the motion.
Okay. Any discussion? If not, all in favor, say aye.
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 Thank you all very much. I am really impressed with all of you. I must tell you that. And thank you for your work to date and your input and your comments. And I'll be back in touch with you as I have further word. Thank you so much.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.